Hey, how's it going? Welcome to the 6th episode of Haverin. In this episode, I'm speaking with Darren Loki McGarvey, and I really enjoyed this conversation. We talk about his upcoming Fringe show, which opens on the 2nd of August, his book, Poverty Safari, and just some of the stuff that's been happening in the news and politics recently. I hope you enjoy the episode. Thanks so much.
Okay, Darren, thanks for coming on the podcast, mate.
My pleasure.
What have you been up to? You've been quite busy the past couple of days.
Aye, it's been, I'm usually pretty busy, but the last couple of days with the drug death statistics being published and becoming kind of public knowledge, then there's a great clamour from media in Scotland, the UK, and even international for a take on it, you know. So I was responding to a lot of that. It's been quite hectic actually. It's cool though, know what I mean? It's nice to be asked to comment on something that you care about and that you feel strongly about. So certainly not complaining, but it's created a big interest in the issue of drugs and addiction, and revealed a lot of the kind of the diversity of attitudes out there towards drug users, which has been quite a reminder really about what we're up against. But there you go.
So what has been some of the feedback? I noticed that on Twitter you've got the Just Say No crowd.
Yeah, you've got people whose understanding of addiction is primarily rooted in assumptions about their own merit in terms of just being able to say no, which basically requires a person to not only have a range of choices available to them at the moment that they intersect with drugs, but also to have the ability to assess those choices and the support around them to act on them. Not everybody has that, so the concept of saying no isn't as simple, and that just say no message has been peddled since the Reagan era. It doesn't make any sense. Drug use is worse in America than it was when they came about with that, so it's kind of trying to get the right balance, isn't it, between just flame-throwing all those people online and finding examples of where people might be persuaded. I recognise that personal responsibility and self-efficacy are important in the recovery journey for people, but those virtues don't deal with the social conditions, the environments, the family dysfunction that becomes a kind of fertile bed from which all of this chaos grows. So I think anyone who thinks that it's just a matter for individual choice that lacks the insight really to be taken seriously in a discussion. So if you do engage, you're just being polite. And unfortunately that kind of weft of public opinion is the majority of the public. Some of it is based on people whose experience with drug users has been negative, family members dying, who family, exhausted themselves trying to help and they didn't get sober, other people being victims of crime. Let's not forget, drug addicts are a terrible nuisance. They can be unsightly, they can be vulgar, things that produce natural feelings of fear and revulsion in people. So it's natural to get that flash in your mind of, I don't like that person, I don't want to be around that person, but I don't know if social policy should be devised around those initial impulses. We're talking about a public health issue, and as many people, this is equivalent to 5 Lockerbie bombings, 52 7/7s. If the trends continue, as many people will have died from accidental overdoses in Scotland in 3 years as what died on 9/11. So it's just the scale of it is unconscionable and needs to be addressed.
So when you're talking about it there, you're clearly informed on the subject. When people in the media come and ask you about it, are they asking you about it in terms of policy and in terms of your informed opinion? Or are they just coming and saying, listen, Darren, as a former addict, can you tell us about this?
Yeah, it depends who you're speaking to. So the more mainstream the media gets and the bigger the audience, then they always need the human interest thing first. Yeah. So they'll come to someone like me or someone who runs a charity for that kind of, I was on Jeremy Vine yesterday, and the first question is, how... No, I'm actually introduced as an addict and as a son of an addict who's dead. I understand why that's about providing context for listeners, but what it also does is feed the narrative that it's about individual stories and individual people. The first question should be, what are the social conditions that's meaning that drug addiction is concentrated in certain areas and not in others? That's the first obvious question to ask. But really that shows that media framing is also part of the challenge, as well as misinformation and ignorance, and sometimes, to be honest, prejudice around drug users themselves. I come at it from an angle of going into every interaction with media with an awareness of how I'm being perceived, what they think that they're getting from me. But I always go in there with my own agenda, so I'm happy to play ball, because getting access to a platform where you might be able to influence how people think about things is one of many prongs in this, ultimately, this information war about drugs.
It's interesting there when you talk about personal responsibility, because I've often wondered with your book, sometimes I see people that might be centre-right messaging you and saying, oh look, here's Darren from a working class background talking about these things. And I often see you tweet back and say, no, have you read the other chapters? Have you understood the nuances in that?
The book's a kind of Rorschach, isn't it? When you try to approach a broad range of political views and you write a book that's designed structurally to bring in different demographics as you progress through it, then, you know, everyone's going to get a feeling on a certain page or a certain chapter where they're being accommodated ideologically. And then they're going to get a section where they're being challenged. And I just felt like that was an important style to approach the book, because coming from a working class community and a working class perspective, I recognise, despite a lot of the narratives that you hear, that actually the working class community is as politically diverse as any other community. That's why you get your Daily Mail and the news agents. That's why everybody, you know, a lot of people, The Sun's the biggest newspaper. Whatever your views are of these publications, they reflect and cater to a specific value system. So I wanted to approach the topic of personal responsibility because I feel the left has at times not found a way to articulate how important it is in life that we, when appropriate and in conjunction with support, can sometimes look inward at how our attitudes and thinking and circular behavioural patterns can sometimes produce circumstances that make our difficulties worse. And anyone who's been through recovery or anyone who's transcended a mental health crisis will know that once the crisis has been dealt with, there's a period of reflection that should go on after that. Now, that doesn't mitigate structural factors, the economic system, political system. Of course not. It's simply a call to action to people who are struggling now, saying, here's what I've learned about struggling, here's what I know, here's some information you might be able to put into use today, without there needing to be a revolution, without there needing to be radical reform, because that's all happening in a very slow motion. And I just wanted a part of the book to address people who are struggling now, for it to be of some utility to them, rather than it being this discussion about hypothesising what might happen in 5, 10, 20 years. But sometimes on the left, just the talk of personal responsibility is offensive, which I find ironic, because obviously the left really is a constant call to our conscience as a society. When you think about all of the discussions rightly that have taken place around what speech is appropriate when referring to specific groups based on the identity spectrum, gender, race, sexuality, then, you know, that's the left saying we're responsible for how we talk and the impact that it has. We're responsible for our behaviour in relationships, our sexual conduct as men, and that we need to take responsibility for that, and not only our own behaviour, but we need to take responsibility in communities of men for modelling a better way to do it and educating ourselves. And I've responded, you know, with varying degrees of dignity to all of these challenges as a man on the left. So I don't know why sometimes the same people who are constantly reiterating those calls to be responsible for how we speak and behave get offended when you say, you know, if you want to get through an addiction problem, part of that is about admitting you've got an addiction problem and asking for help, which are both acts that require self-will, which is personal responsibility.
I think I also see you tweet to these people, I hope you're going to enjoy the second book as much, because that's going to be coming at things from a completely different angle.
Well, one of the things, you know, that for all the criticism, obviously, that you get sometimes when people don't think you've went in hard enough on the typical targets associated with poverty and things like that, At the same time, if you write something that someone on the right kind of agrees with or thinks, oh, that's surprising to hear a left-wing person saying that, then really what they're doing is they're telling me either that they're kind of biased because I'm pandering to them, or that maybe they're open-minded and that they'll be looking forward to what I have to say about some of the values associated with right-wing thinking. Merit, personal responsibility, public school conservatism, these mad contradictions that we have in society now, where we have men who want to be in charge of women's reproductive rights. We have social conservatives who care about the sanctity of life as long as that life is a fetus. And the minute that the kid is born, if the mother's poor, it's like, fuck you. Do you know what I mean? Like, welcome to the hostile environment. And we have people who think that kids being educated about LGBT issues in school is going to turn their children gay, which shows a tremendous lack of confidence in the role that they play in their own child's life, if they think that what their kid learns in school is going to be so influential that it's going to dictate their sexuality. So these things need to be addressed, and not necessarily because I'm going to like speak on those particular issues. It's just outlining some of the contradictions that emerge from a worldview that is almost kind of a relic of a former time where those ideas were fashionable and maybe even progressive in their day. But as people are living longer, then the political spectrum is stretched to capacity. It's, people living to 80 and 90 and still voting is a relatively new thing. People didn't live that long, even just 10 generations ago. The average life expectancy was 40. So there's tremendous strain on political discourse and what we think the direction of society is, because some people's ideas of what society should be change the older they get, and the world changes around them so quick they might hold on to the ideas they used to have so tightly and become nostalgic about them, when really sometimes you've got to update them. And I think we're seeing some of the problems of trying to superimpose conservatism on communities that have nothing to conserve. The notions of the 2.4 family, understanding that conservative virtue of family being the bulwark of a cohesive community and looking after your family and, generating wealth and prosperity for your family is how you generate wealth for a society, in theory. But a lot of the economic reforms that the Conservative Party brought in placed tremendous strain on those family dynamics in working class communities, and now we don't have those kind of families a lot of the time. Single mums a lot of the time, dads who knows where they are sometimes. And still we try to impose that and incentivise family and incentivise heterosexual relationships through the tax system and other kind of incentives or costs that people might pay for not conforming to those ideas. And there's just such a distance between people who hold those views and the people on the receiving end of all the policies that come from them, that I do think that is one of the big problems of society right now. We're living in two different worlds, almost as different as the world that we understand through gravitational physics and quantum physics. Things just behave differently. The same forces don't have the same impacts on different people. It's one law for one and one law for other.
A really interesting point that I heard you make in the interview with Ewan on Summerhall Radio was this idea of, I think you called it the Mad Max model of social mobility, where if you took people from different ends of the spectrum and dropped them into some kind of desert island, that it's not clear who would fare better. The people that come up with the idea of social mobility wouldn't necessarily be the most socially mobile in a Mad Max kind of situation. And
it was a point I was making about merit versus circumstance. So the idea of merit's not that dangerous when we're talking about this kind of level of society, where we understand it's a mixture between the environments we're born into and our ability to navigate them successfully, educate ourselves, show competence, make good choices, and have support when we make inevitable mistakes. The further up the food chain you get, this idea of merit becomes dangerous, because the people up there believe they're there because they're worthy. And a way to test whether they're worthy or not is to remove all of the signifiers of their privilege, remove everything that they depend on to remain where they are, and put them in a community at the bottom and just say, okay, get from there to there, go. And you will find that they probably wouldn't survive it, you know, but it would need to be Mad Max, it would need to be a kind of Total Recall, like almost like dystopian game show scenario, you know what I mean, like Jeremy Kyle from Hell, where really what we would be trying to see is them coming to terms with the fact that it's the environment that drives progress. Nations rise and fall based on their proximity to other countries, based on their geographical location, and where other countries happen to be economically and militarily at a certain place in history. Communities succeed or thrive or degenerate based on the economic and social conditions in which they're often found. And it's the same for people. I mean, even this planet, it only formed and became a place that was able to nurture life because of the distance it was from the sun, which allowed liquid water to form. If you look at Venus and you look at Mars, the process almost started and then it either collapsed or just didn't get going. So it's just total luck that we're even alive at all. So the idea that Boris Johnson is in spitting distance of Downing Street because of his own competence is quite ludicrous when you really think about it on that broader scale.
So let's talk specifically about your Fringe show now. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Well, I'm kind of throwing in stuff for the Fringe show just now because I'm not getting any warm-up gigs. So I tried to throw in a couple of jokes for the Fringe in the last podcast. Okay. Normally I would be gigging a lot, so I would be getting to test out material, but I've just been locked away working on things. Yeah. So I don't really have the chance to preview things to see what works. So really it'll be a refining process as the show goes forward. But the show deals with a lot of the stuff I'm talking about, social mobility and social immobility. The kind of parallel story of the country, parts of the country grinding to a halt, economically, socially, and me enjoying unprecedented levels of opportunity and social mobility because my life kind of changed overnight when I won the Orwell Prize. And you make a lot of observations when that happens. First of all, you observe that as your economic circumstances change, your interests change, or you feel that they could change if you let them. So suddenly your concerns are no longer, sorting out the next household bill, make sure you get enough money to provide the basics. Suddenly your interests turn to, we need to get double glazing windows. You need a new car. And slowly but surely this kind of changes you a wee bit because you're becoming a wee bit detached from the life that you used to really understand very intimately. So that process, the longer it goes on, what I'm experiencing is really the pull of the centre ground, right? And the centre ground and centrism is really key to understanding where we are politically. Ultimately, you have a lot of people in the middle class who want a fairer society, but they get a bit frightened when we talk about some of the more radical proposals in order to create it. And part of the reason for that is, even though people in the centre materially have enough and they can generate opportunities and their lives are self-sustaining in a certain way, they don't feel like they have enough. They're still financially insecure. A lot of them, because this is a growth economy, no matter where you are, even billionaires, they're still always trying to get more. Why is that? It's because they still feel insecure relative to what they have. And that has implications for politics, because while people in the centre might not be as socially remote from people in the upper class or people, further along the conservative scale, then there's a sensibility in the centre ground. There's this kind of tacit acceptance that you need to be civil, that you need to be polite, that you need to be reasonable, and that certain forms of political expression or behaviour are out of bounds, that certain issues are out of bounds. Do you ever notice how most of the centrist commentariat all have the same viewpoint on someone like Jeremy Corbyn? The same viewpoint on Israel, the same viewpoint on the fundamental precepts of our society. Now, I know that I'm heading towards the centre ground because see, when I go to speak about those things, or I go to think about my opinion or what I might say, this new filter comes into my thinking of, actually probably better not say that. Because I realise my social mobility is not just about my talent or my merit. It's contingent on me behaving in a certain way or being seen to behave in a certain way. And so the show really dives down as honestly as I can into that. Because I think a lot of people recognise when they're going through that transition, and then they forget once they've gone through it. So you go through this crucible of becoming middle class, or this crucible of becoming a moderate, and you write off who you used to be to immaturity, or to naivety, or to idealism, when really what you're doing is you're making incremental concessions to your integrity in recognition that you'll be more financially and professionally stable. And then you're retrofitting that process with a new story that dismisses who you used to be. And you know, try to create an entertaining show about that's potentially challenging in the belly of the beast, Edinburgh Fringe. It's not like I'm performing to radical lefties who are going to eat it all up. You know, there's a certain skill involved in being able to deliver that medicine just sweet enough that it might go down in a way that doesn't make everyone walk out early.
So the Fringe show that you did last year, did you do that in Glasgow as well? Did you tour with it a little bit?
I did. I do a kind of end of the year show last couple of years, DF with DF concerts, and I think this year we're going to tour. So there'll be one in Glasgow. I think Edinburgh's now booked, Dundee. But I full run at the Fringe starting 2nd of August. The show's going to be a laugh as well, you know. And much of it really drawing on the absurdity of my own life at the minute, where suddenly I find myself in a place where I have these new complaints and concerns and things that trouble me and stress me out. But when I compare them to people who are actually in poverty, they seem indulgent and embarrassing almost. And so in one sense they are, and in another sense have become isolated within this success, because all my social connections formerly are with people from my sort of life. So you find it harder to talk to people from that kind of background about, you know, how to handle your money, for example. Do you know what I mean? I've got a pal of mine, he's a well-known writer, and he's made a lot of money, right? And, you know, meet him from time to time, he'll give me a wee text when he's in town, I'll go and see him. And the first things I always talk to him about, do you know what I mean, is what I'm going through financially. So the first time I think I had met him, it was like money was just coming from everywhere. And I was just like, wow. And the money kind of didn't have a value in the first place because I don't come from money. I've not been trained how to save money and think about money, and it's just this thing that comes and goes. You just kind of get used to it. It's just been this scarce thing. And then it comes and it's no value attached to it. So you're very generous with it. You know, you get a sense it's just going to keep coming like that. And then obviously the work that you've done stops, the next advance doesn't come until you finish the next book. You've got to write another show, you've got to go back in the hamster wheel. And then, you know, you get taxed and you're just like, or you're going to get taxed, and you remember, you forget, you've been behaving as if a lot of the money isn't going to go into the public purse, and rightly so. But even just hearing myself say that is embarrassing. But I've got to be honest about the new forces bearing down on me and how they're changing me or trying to change me. And I think there's an interesting show in there about that. One, for people who might wonder what it's like to go on that hypothetical success journey for someone like me. And two, for the people who have had their own version of it, having come from a certain background and then went to university and got into a profession and settled down, right, which is becoming moderate.
Yeah.
So hopefully it speaks to a wee bit of the quantum mechanics of the times that we live in, rather than what we're always talking about, which is political personalities and parties and economics, when self-interest and fear and insecurity drives a lot of political behaviour and thinking in a way that I think we need to get better at grappling with.
So for you, are those things synonymous, being middle class and being a moderate?
No, not necessarily, but I do think that you would find it harder to ascend professionally and economically if you're always expressing your displeasure at everything that's going on, and your workplace, and how are you going to get promoted if you're always join a union? Do you know what I mean? Like, how are you? The reason that radicals are marginalised is precisely because they bring a radical energy to bear in everything that they do. So that's why they stay in their own radical communities and they create their own hierarchies to move up and down, right? Because there's not a lot of chance that if you're openly radical that you're going to find a place in mainstream society, whether it's media, whatever it is. Do you know what I mean? And if you do, it's because you've learned to conceal your true feelings, or you've learned to modulate them in a way. That's what I've learned, is that I pick my battles now. I used to fight every battle. Do you know? I used to be engaged in multiple fronts with all sorts. People in the arts, people in politics, rappers. Do you know? Just like. Do you know what I mean? And then I just got to scrape myself too thin and realise if I conserve my energy, I dedicate myself to maybe one or two of these things, or maybe one thing at a time, then I don't feel so overwrought with it all. But also you learn when you should take up arms and when you should try and engage in dialogue. And sometimes that's about what's conducive to being persuasive or what the context calls for. But sometimes it's also about, if I was to start getting all shouty in a situation like this, then that opportunity that's beyond the horizon might not appear. And I'm thinking long term about myself, as well as the concerns I have about my community and the concerns I have about the issues that I talk about. And I'm not ashamed to be honest about that. I think everyone is in that. It's just a case of, are you aware of it and are you honest with yourself about it? But certainly that plays a role in what we're experiencing just now politically.
So are you coming at it from a purely artistic point of view? I mean, obviously because you're an artist. Like, is there a value judgment attached to it? Or are you just reflecting your experiences? Which kind of angle are you coming at that question from?
I think apart from, I think I've got about maybe 15-20 minutes of the show where I have to go in hard on Theresa May and Boris Johnson. I've got an obligation to do that. This last year has been an absolute shit show, and I think in Theresa May's resignation speech we get the best insight into the different reality that she lives in. So when she remarks on what she regards as her achievements, really it's just this kind of obituary for society. The hostile environment policy, the Grenfell inquiry, action on racial discrimination, more people in work than ever before. Like, what are you talking about? You know what I mean? Like, what are you actually talking about? She believes that, and she's fortified in an environment that is constantly reiterating that is the right belief to have. So that needs to be remarked on. When Theresa May wept at the final part, she was weeping for herself. She felt sorry for herself, that she was misunderstood. And that tells you a lot. She couldn't muster up a tear in Lancaster West Estate the morning after they were bringing the bodies out of the Grenfell Tower. And if she did cry, she cried in private. But maybe people in that community would have appreciated a bit of emotion for her instead of trying to run out the back of a church in case she got pulled up. She instituted the Grenfell inquiry when she realised she had misjudged public opinion and brought Britain to a fucking cliff edge of civil unrest on this issue. And then you get Boris, the meritocrat, who was a bit of a character, and I just think in him you really get a clue as to how the absurd extremes that democracy can produce when people of a certain social caste really have an iron grip on not just power but all of the social networks and pathways to it, because he's not even fit to write a column in a newspaper, quite frankly, given everything that's coming out about his dishonesty in every profession that he's been involved in. And I'm not saying hold a person's mistakes against him. I'm not saying he doesn't have some redeeming qualities. I'm not saying his family and all that don't love him or that he doesn't deserve love. I'm saying this guy's no cut out to be in charge of a whole country. Like, London was a stretch. A whole country? Everything he says is mental. Like, he's off his nut. Do you know what I mean? His whole strategy has been avoid the media because it will reveal more and more what a muppet he is. And so I need to go in hard on that. But ultimately I think that the show, the message of the show is that the current kind of 3-tier system we have socially, lower class, middle class, upper class, with the economic model that's underpinning it, where wealth is not distributed equally, then we're creating circumstances for democratic and social instability. It's just inevitable that friction points are going to emerge, and that this is going to have an impact on public discourse and the integrity of our society.
And how does this all fit in regards to Scotland for you? Post independence debate. I speak to some people and they just kind of feel a bit lost in Scotland right now. What was once a kind of grassroots, vibrant left-wing movement where there was a lot of discussion of ideas has now kind of faded out and been replaced with a kind of empty nationalism.
Well, there's a sort of there is a nationalist fold in politics across most countries now in Europe, and it's Russian roulette, the kind of quality of the sentiment. I think that it does bear a lot of similar features, but sometimes if you have the right sort of leader regimenting it, it can be less destructive, it can be less reactionary, and that's obviously the case in Scotland, at least towards many of the issues that people in England seem to have different opinions about, although the attitudes of some Scottish nationalists towards English people are almost equivalent to the attitude of some English people towards immigrants, which I'm not getting into what's worse, do you know what I mean? But the situation, I think, once you've kind of become, every single person who is identified as a nationalist might not identify themselves as one. Everybody has a complex kind of background to their thoughts, what brought them to their political point of view. But I think, for example, yesterday, you see a lot of people online, and the first thing that they're trying to do when they see that these drug death statistics are so bad is immediately attribute blame to Westminster. When actually there's a lot of blame to go around. Politics, third sector, there's even blame within the public. I'm accepting responsibility as a citizen in this country because it's my actions and my participation that signals to politicians what I think is acceptable or unacceptable in terms of what they should be doing in my country. So we all bear a bit of responsibility, and I think it's quite juvenile and opportunistic and short-sighted when your first instinct is to pin the blame on a certain party. There are some issues where I wouldn't take that viewpoint. Welfare reform, hostile environment, it's very clear what the source of that problem is. But with the drug deaths, then I think that we're talking about policy over a 40-year period, which means everybody's had a hand in the situation that we're currently in, whether it's SNP, Labour, Tories, Lib Dems, and obviously that's why I wouldn't use these deaths to launch an argument about Scottish independence, not least when the Scottish Government and the SNP are talking about instituting a society with all the same precepts as we have now. Which is what often produces these vast inequalities where this kind of extreme expression of poverty comes from. So I don't know how you deal with inequality by creating a system that's just as subservient to banks and financial class. And I'm not saying all those things are bad. I recognise we need banks, and I recognise we need finance, and I get that, but it's just this idea that any fundamental change in our society has to be run past them first is why we have an obesity crisis, an opioid crisis. It's why our environment is fucked. It's why we have mental health crisis. We've given corporations a blank cheque to go out and take the burden off of the state and in many ways manage and facilitate organised human life, but we've not performed risk assessments on what the implications of that might be for wealth polarisation and all of these areas of human health that are impacted. And I don't see any signal that the main body of the independence movement is desiring anything different but a Scottish flag on all of this. Although I know that there is maybe more diversity of opinion within nationalism than that kind of facetious comment might suggest. You just take an aggregate sometimes, don't you, off social media? And there's another one, you know, Facebook, Twitter, Silicon Valley, run forth, bring society together into a utopia of perfect communication. And what have we done? We've polarised the same way we did with the printing press, polarised the same way we did when we got a Bible in our hands that says the word of God's going to sort yous all right out, you know. We just went to war about it. Human beings are not as evolved as they think they are.
So in regards to policy, what do you think can be done about some of these issues?
The Scottish Government have announced these kind of child poverty grants that will be out in, you know, I think they're talking 2022 or something, which might be a wee bit late. I hope that they'll fast track that. We're talking about, you know, clean rooms for people to use in. The Daily Record is through its editorial weight behind decriminalisation of drugs, which is perhaps the most significant development in the discussion about drugs in the last 10 or 15 years, maybe even more. The ingredients are there to change things, but as is usually the case, there has to be a strong body of public opinion that's consistent on letting the government know that change is required. I mean, why do we have Brexit? Why do we have Brexit? Why do we have the hostile environment policy? Why did we have the welfare reforms? I mean, a lot of us on the left think, who comes up with this stuff? It's because a lot of the voting population want those things, or some variant of them. And then it's a case of how incompetently will the government go about that business. But actually, there's a big body of opinion that thinks the welfare state is too soft, that thinks the immigration is too soft. And that's why the government have done it, because those people are making their voices heard in some way. Now we're making our voices heard, but it's a kind of, we're not consistent around one issue. The left is fragmented in a lot of different kind of hobby horses, and has found it difficult to coalesce, even on the issue of independence, even on the issue of Brexit. You know, sometimes I think maybe it's an issue of there's not necessarily a leadership figure there that everyone can get behind, you know, and then all these folds constitutionally and all that as well. Like, some people who might agree with Corbyn's policies just don't like Corbyn because he spoke out against independence, so everything he says is seen through that lens. And so sometimes I think we can take up arms against people with a ferocity that's not necessarily deserving, given all the common ground that we have with people sometimes, apart from maybe one fundamental issue. I do think, unfortunately, as optimistic as I am in the long run for humanity, I think often progress or change comes when we hit a cliff edge, when it becomes apparent, not just to the people specialising in the different areas that can see the crisis that's unfolding in real time, whether it's environment or social problems, but also that then reverberates up to people who have the real power or political influence, in order to say, like they did with the New Deal in America, we have to make concessions to the population because the financial services have crashed the economy and it's having ripples all around the world. So here's the New Deal, welfare. We're going to pay our population to build our roads, to build our motorways. That was quite radical, but it was a concession from the so-called elites, as was the welfare state in the UK, the NHS, the radical social house building programme. All of these things were, you know, William Beveridge has, you know, his whole kind of take on where we had to shift as a society came from a centrist place. But the radical ideas came from the left. and came from talking to working class people, and then that was all sort of translated into middle class, and was put through as legislation. And that's often how it works, isn't it? Free school meals, free prescriptions, free bus travel. These were all Scottish Socialist Party policies in Scotland not long ago, and now it's, you know, centrist managerial governments that take the credit for bringing them in.
So, what the fuck do we do, mate? How do you stay optimistic?
Well, there is, obviously, we've got to see where we are as a civilization and a society in the broader context. To be born in this day and age is a better time than any other time in history.
Sure.
In terms of the opportunities that are there, the amount of information that's available, health, life expectancy, democratic society ultimately still does exist and can be quite robust. I mean, just look at how Brexit is being kind of almost postponed because our democratic institutions, while it's driving us mental, are performing their function by reflecting the conflict in the population, which has brought us to a state of complete standstill. So it's not always easy when you're consumed by life's drudgerous concerns and stresses to look at the broad scale of our kind of this project of human society and say, we're hitting a wee snag, but this is a good time to be alive. Of all the places in the world that you could be, this is one of the better ones. And not necessarily to be grateful for that, but to see the opportunity in that and the cause to be optimistic. Because we have only been alive for a tiny wee amount of time. You know, we will be looked back on by our future selves as quite primitive and quite hubristic and very ambitious and just trying to reach out for the answer, but just not being able to get it together. But obviously that doesn't mean a lot when we're in the time that we're in. I just think that wasn't it long ago, you know what I mean? People didn't have a window. It was like, right, we're going to need that big stone moved, you know, like fucking 10 miles, please. Come on, guys, bring the big stone. We're going to build a thing that points at the sun to try and measure whether this is August or not, you know. And it kind of sometimes can seem a bit glib or whatever to make that sort of comparison, but it's a tremendous amount of progress that we've made, you know, from just being basic humans with some core apps about hunting and shagging and killing and eating to trying to facilitate freedom and liberty and ideological struggle and moral and democratic innovation and technology, and it's easy to take it for granted.
Well, man, I loved your book, I love your music, I loved your show last year, and I'm really looking forward to your show this year.
Great, it's been good to chat to you, mate. Thank you.